On a map, Canada can look familiar, just another country above the United States, but the numbers don't behave like a normal country. This is nearly 10 million square kilometers of land stitched to three oceans by a coastline so long it becomes hard to imagine about 243,000 kilometers of edges, inlets, islands, and cold breathing water. And not long ago, much of this continent sat beneath an ice sheet, kilometers thick, heavy enough to press the earth down like a thumbprint. So what happens when a place is that vast and still in a way, still rising back up? Who learned to live inside that scale, and who is living with its consequences now? Canada is not one landscape. It is a stitched-together continent of ancient rock-young mountains, drowned valleys and plains that used to be seabed. From the air, the first thing that stands out is the sheer pattern of water. Lakes, rivers, marshes, fjords, and bays that seem to repeat endlessly as if the land forgot where to stop carving. That pattern is not random. It is the fingerprint of ice. During the last ice age, enormous ice sheets spread across much of what is now Canada, not as a thin winter blanket, but as a moving, grinding mass, thick enough to reshape entire regions. Where the ice advanced, it scraped bedrock clean, dragging stones like sandpaper across stone. Where it paused and melted, it left behind ridges of debris, fields of rounded gravel and basins that later filled with water. That is why so much of Canada is a mosaic of lakes' water, sitting in the shallow scars of an ice-pressed world. At the heart of the story lies the Canadian Shield, some of the oldest exposed rock on Earth. It forms a broad arc around Hudson Bay, a vast foundational platform of hard granite and metamorphic stone. The shield does not feel dramatic in the way mountains do. It feels patient. Its landscapes are often low and rolling, dotted with pine, birch, and dark water. Yet this is where the country's deep time is most visible. Thin soils bear rock, and a terrain shaped less by earthquakes and volcanoes than by long erosion and the blunt force of ice. Move west, and the continent rises into the Rockies, young by geological standards, restless compared with the Shield. Here, tectonic forces folded and lifted rock layers into jagged ridges, high passes and glacial bowls. In places like Banff and Jasper, the mountains look sharp enough to cut the sky, and even in summer, the highest slopes hold permanent snowfields. The valleys below carry a different kind of color, milky turquoise lakes, fed by glacial flour, fine rock powder, suspended in meltwater, turning water into a luminous, unreal blue. On the Pacific edge, British Columbia becomes a world of coastal mountains and temperate rainforest. Where the air is wet, the trees grow massive, and the shoreline breaks apart into islands and channels. This coastline does not run in a straight line. It fractures, it folds, it hides. Fjords slice deep into the land, long, narrow inlets bordered by steep walls, formed when glaciers carved valleys and then retreated, allowing the sea to move in and claim the empty space. The ocean here is not merely a border, it is a visitor that wandered inland. And then there is the north, an entire realm shaped by cold. In the Arctic archipelago, islands scatter across polar water like broken pieces of continent. Tundra stretches low and open, where the ground can be permanently frozen beneath a thin, active layer that thaws briefly each summer. Permafrost changes everything: how water drains, how plants grow, how roads crack, how buildings must be anchored. Here, the land is not simply land. It is a surface over a hidden constraint, a frozen architecture that holds the ground together until it doesn't. Even now, Canada is still responding to that vanished weight of ice. In some regions, the Earth continues to rise slowly, an aftershock measured not in tremors, but in millimeters per year, because the crust is rebounding from the pressure it endured for thousands of years. It is a quiet motion, almost imperceptible, yet it changes shorelines, alters drainage patterns, and reshapes bays over long time scales. The idea is unsettling in the best way. A country that appears stable on a map, but is still flexing like a muscle waking up. This vast geography creates extreme climates that sit side by side. Along the Pacific coast, winters are wet and comparatively mild, softened by ocean influence. Across the prairies, the continent opens wide, allowing air masses to sweep in unbroken, bringing bitter cold in winter heat and storms in summer. In central and eastern Canada, long winters lock lakes under ice, while summers can suddenly turn humid and lush. Farther north, the sun itself becomes an event, months of bright summer daylight, then long stretches of darkness, where the cold feels deeper because there is no visible escape. Water links all these regions, but it also divides them. Canada's rivers are not just scenic lines. They are moving corridors that carried ice melt nutrients, fish, and later people. Some rivers cut through ancient rock, forming falls and rapids that once forced travel to slow down and reroute. Others spread into deltas and marshes where wildlife gathers and where life becomes dense and loud. Birds, insects, reeds moving in wind. Then, the rivers meet the oceans, and Canada becomes a three-ocean nation. In practice, not just in trivia, Atlantic fog and storm swells, Pacific rain and deep currents, Arctic sea ice, and the silence of polar water. The land scale also creates a strange psychological effect. In places, the horizon looks close mountains, forests, city skylines. In other places, the horizon feels infinite flat prairie under a dome of sky or tundra, where the eye searches for anything tall enough to anchor distance. Canada's geology is not just a backstory, it is the stage itself. It decides where forests can root, where animals migrate, where towns can survive, where roads can exist, and where humans must adapt or retreat. So the question becomes sharper. If the ground beneath this country was sculpted by ice, lifted by tectonics, and is still slowly rebounding today, what does stable really mean here? Canada's living world is built on distance. Not just the distance between cities, but the distance between ecosystems, between saltwater and freshwater, between rainforest and tundra, between grassland and boreal forest. In many countries, nature feels like something squeezed between human structures. Here, in huge stretches of Canada, nature is still the structure, and human presence can feel like a temporary visitor. The great backbone of Canada's ecology is the boreal forest, a vast belt of spruce, fir, pine, and birch that stretches across the country like a dark green tide. From above, it looks endless. From the ground, it feels like a world made of needles and silence, interrupted by sudden flashes of water. In summer, the air can be heavy with resin and damp moss. In winter, the same forest becomes a corridor of snow and shadow, where sound is swallowed and every footstep feels amplified. The boreal is not one uniform forest. It shifts with latitude, soil, and moisture, but it is one of the planet's most important living regions. A massive carbon storehouse, a breeding ground for migratory birds, and a long connected habitat for large mammals. In the boreal and the forests that fringe it, the iconic animals are not just symbols. They are engineers of the landscape. Moose move like slow-moving shadows at the edge of wetlands, feeding on aquatic plants and leaves. Their long legs aren't just for snow, they are for marsh and water, for crossing a world that is half liquid. Wolves patrol the margins between forest and open ground, sometimes invisible, until you notice the stillness of everything else. Bears, black bears in many regions. Grizzlies farther west follow seasonal calendars of berries, salmon, and fattening. And everywhere there are beavers, small bodies with huge consequences. By building dams, beavers create ponds. Slow rivers raise water tables and shape entire wetland systems. In a country defined by water, beavers are one of the quiet forces that decide where water will linger. Move west, and the ecology changes dramatically. Along the Pacific coast, temperate rainforests rise in thick layers, cedar, hemlock, moss ferns, where the air itself feels alive with moisture. This coast can be a green cathedral, dim and dripping with trunks wider than a person's reach, and branches that hang with lichen like old fabric. Here, rivers become lifelines for salmon, and salmon become lifelines for everything else. Each year, salmon return from the ocean to spawn upstream, bringing marine nutrients into the forest. Bears drag fish into the trees. Eagles gather along riverbanks. Even the soil gets richer because the ocean has been carried inland piece by piece in the bodies of fish. In the Rocky Mountains, the living world climbs in layers. Lower valleys can support dense forests. Higher elevations shift to subalpine meadows, where summer feels brief and intensely bright. Above that is the alpine rock wind and patches of stubborn vegetation. In these heights, survival is a narrow window. Marmots whistle warnings. Mountain goats pick their way across ledges that look impossible. In late summer, wildflowers bloom as if trying to compress an entire season into a few weeks. And then snow returns and the mountains reset. Across the prairies, parts of Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Canada, becomes open, and the ecology becomes a story of grass, wind, and space. Historically, these grasslands supported bison herds, moving like weather systems, and predators that followed them. Today, much of the prairie landscape has been transformed by agriculture. But the ecological memory remains in fragments. Protected grasslands, wetlands that fill and empty with the seasons, and migratory flight. Birds travel thousands of kilometers in spring and fall. And see Canada as a corridor, not just a place. Geese, ducks, and shorebirds using its rivers and wetlands as refueling stations on journeys that connect continents. Then the world thins into the north. In the Arctic, the tundra is not empty, it is simply low. Life here hugs the ground. Mosses, lichens, and hardy shrubs grow close to the soil, built for wind and cold. In summer, the tundra can explode into color for a moment. Tiny flowers, sudden insects, birds, nesting in frantic haste. Caribou move across this land in long migrations following ancient routes that exist, not on roads, but in instinct and tradition. Arctic foxes patrol the edges of what is possible. Polar bears in coastal regions depend on sea ice as a hunting platform, walking an unstable boundary between land and water. And here the ecological clock is tied to ice. When sea ice forms, later breaks earlier or becomes thinner, it changes the entire timetable of hunting movement and survival. The Arctic is often described as remote, but ecologically it is connected to everything. What happens here does not stay here. Changes in ice and ocean currents ripple outward, influencing weather patterns farther south. The North can feel like the edge of the world, but in climate terms, it is a central nerve. Canada also holds some of the world's richest freshwater systems. The Great Lakes region, shared with the United States, contains an astonishing volume of surface freshwater, and the rivers and wetlands that connect these lakes become corridors for fish birds and human settlement. In the far north, freshwater lakes can be so clear and cold they feel almost sterile at first glance, yet they support specialized life, adapted to short summers and long freezes. But Canada's biodiversity is not just about abundance. It is also about fragility, especially in a warming world. The boreal forest, despite its scale, can burn. Fire is not new here. It has always been part of the forest's cycle. Some trees even depend on heat to open cones and release seeds. But in recent years, the rhythm of fire has become less predictable, and in some seasons, it has become overwhelming. When fires burn hotter, spread faster, and reach farther north, they do more than remove trees. They change soil chemistry, disrupt wildlife habitat, and send smoke across thousands of kilometers, turning distant cities into hazy orange-lit rooms under an unfamiliar sky. In places where permafrost begins to thaw, the land itself can collapse into wetlands or slumps, changing drainage and releasing long-stored carbon. In coastal regions, warming oceans affect marine food webs. Salmon runs can shift, species ranges move northward. Some animals adapt, others run out of habitat. Biodiversity is not just a list of species, it is a moving negotiation between temperature, water, time, and space. Yet despite these pressures, Canada still contains some of the largest remaining wild areas on Earth. There are landscapes where human lights disappear completely, where the night sky becomes dense with stars, and where the sounds are elemental wind through spruce waves on rock, the far-off call of a loon on a lake that has no road leading to it. These are not just beautiful places. They are functioning systems, living machines of water carbon and migration that make the planet more stable. Which makes the next question unavoidable. If Canada's ecosystems are this vast, this interconnected, and still at times wild, how did humans first learn to live here? And what does it mean to belong to a land where winter can feel like a law? Long before Canada was a country, long before it was a name on a map, it was a set of decisions made in cold air. The first human stories here are not written in ink. They are written in roots across ice, along rivers, through forests, and over wind-scoured ground, where survival depended on reading the land like a language. During the last ice age, much of the northern continent was sealed under ice. But even then, the world was not frozen in stillness. Sea levels where lower coastlines were different, and corridors opened and closed over time. People moved when the land allowed it. They followed animals. They followed water. They followed the narrow margins where life was possible. And as the glaciers retreated, new spaces emerged, fresh valleys, young lakes, river systems that began to run again. Canada, in many ways, was a continent being revealed. Human presence here grew alongside that reveal. Archaeology can offer dates and artifacts, stone tools, camp remains, traces of hearths, but it cannot fully capture what mattered most: knowledge. Early cultures in this land were built around a deep literacy of seasons. When ice forms, when it breaks, where fish gather, how wind shifts before a storm. What berries ripen first, where animals return year after year. In a place as large as Canada, there was never one single early culture. There were many shaped by the demands of coast, forest, prairie, and tundra. On the Pacific coast, the ocean offered abundant salmon runs, shellfish sea mammals, kelp forests. Coastal communities learned to live with tides and storms, building technology and traditions around woodwater and navigation. The rainforest was not an obstacle. It was a resource cedar for shelter and tools, woven bark and fiber stories embedded in carved forms and oral memory. Here, culture could root in place because food returned reliably, and the sea's calendar could be learned and passed down. In the interior forests and along the great river systems, life was more mobile. People followed caribou and other game, traveled by canoe through networks of lakes and rivers, and built seasonal patterns around hunting, fishing, and gathering. The forest demanded patience, tracking, listening, interpreting subtle signs. Winter demanded planning. Spring demanded movement. In these regions, the land itself became a map, one drawn in remembered portages and known landmarks, not in paper lines. Far to the north, the Arctic shaped a different kind of human adaptation, one of the most remarkable on Earth. In Inuit and other northern traditions, survival was not simply endurance, it was precision. Ice was not a blank surface. It was a shifting architecture with weak points, pressure ridges, and safe routes. Snow was not just cold, it was building material. Hunting was not just pursuit, it was an understanding of animal behavior, wind direction, and the long logic of patience. Tools and clothing were engineered to perform in conditions where exposed skin could become dangerous in minutes. What makes these early cultures especially striking is that they did not conquer nature in the way modern myths sometimes suggest. They learned to negotiate with it, build in relationships with animals, weather, and place that were spiritual, practical, and communal at the same time. Many indigenous worldviews carry an understanding that humans are not above the land, but inside it, responsible to it. In a landscape that can feel indifferent, that relationship becomes not just philosophy, but survival strategy. Across the plains and prairie edge regions where the horizon opens and wind has room to accelerate, cultures formed around movement and wide-scale ecology. In these open lands, animal herds and seasonal fires shaped the grass itself. Human life here depended on understanding distance, how far water is, where shelter can be found, where herds will shift under weather pressure. Later, this openness would be dramatically altered by agriculture and settlement. But the earlier reality was a living grass ocean, one that demanded navigation without walls. Canada's early human story is also an oral story. For many Indigenous peoples, history is not locked into a written archive. It lives in spoken narrative stories that carry geography, law, ethics, and memory. Some stories encode environmental knowledge. What happens when salmon runs fail? How to behave around dangerous waters? Why certain places are sacred? Others describe origins and migrations in ways that can resonate with the land's visible features. Mountains, islands, inlets, linking identity to place. in a way that is both literal and symbolic. And then there is a crucial truth that sits beneath any talk of early Canada. The diversity is immense. Canada is home to many nations, languages, and cultural systems. Even the categories outsiders often use First Nations, Inuit, Métis, are broad umbrellas over hundreds of distinct communities. There was never one single way to live here. There were many answers to the same question. How do you belong to a land that can be generous and lethal in the same week? The Métis story emerging later, through the meeting of Indigenous communities and European fur traders, would become one of Canada's defining cultural bridges. Its own peoplehood, its own languages and traditions, shaped by trade routes and shifting political borders. But even before that historical turning point, the foundations of survival were already laid: travel, technology, seasonal knowledge, governance systems, and ways of relating to land and water that proved resilient across centuries. Seen this way, early human life in Canada is not a preface. It is the root system of everything that came after. The rivers that carried canoes would later carry trade. The portages that linked lake to lake would become the logic behind future routes. The places that were sacred or strategically important would become contested. And the knowledge that kept people alive in harsh environments would later be dismissed by newcomers, sometimes catastrophically, only to be recognized again when modern systems failed in the face of weather and distance. So the next question is not merely historical, it is structural. When outsiders arrived with maps and flags, what did they misunderstand about this land? And what did they take from the people who already knew its rules? When European exploration pushed into what is now Canada, it did not enter an empty world. It entered a world already mapped, just not on paper. Rivers were highways. Portages were intersections. Coastlines were memory. And in many places, the first real discoveries were not geographic at all. They were misunderstandings, outsiders, arriving with compasses and crowns, unable to see that the most valuable thing here was not a route, it was knowledge. The Atlantic edge became one of the earliest points of contact. Fishing fleets crossed the ocean for cod-rich waters, and the coastline of Newfoundland and the Gulf of St. Lawrence turned into a working frontier, harsh, seasonal, and profitable. Inland, the St. Lawrence River opened like a corridor into the continent, linking the ocean to the Great Lakes system, a chain of freshwater, so vast it feels like inland seas. Along this water network, trading posts appeared, settlements grew. But the continent did not open simply because Europeans arrived. It opened because Indigenous guides, traders, and diplomats made movement possible. Over time, a new economy began to dominate the fur trade. In Europe, beaver pelts became currency for fashion, felt hats that signaled status. In Canada, that demand turned rivers into commercial arteries. The Hudson's Bay Company and other trading networks expanded outward from posts like hinges on a map pushing deeper into the interior. Canoes carried goods in both directions, metal tools, textiles, and firearms moving inland, pelts moving out. But the fur trade was not just economics. It was diplomacy alliance, and often violent competition. It rearranged relationships between communities, intensified conflicts, and tethered local survival to distant markets that did not understand the land's limits. This period also created a cultural and political bridge that would become uniquely Canadian: the rise of the Métis Nation. Through relationships between European traders and Indigenous communities, new families formed, rooted in both worlds, but fully belonging to neither of the colonial categories that outsiders tried to impose. Métis culture developed its own identity, languages, music, and political presence, shaped by travel trade and the shifting boundaries of power. In many ways, the Métis story is a reminder that history is not a clean sequence of flags changing hands. It is a human mixing a negotiation, a constant improvisation under pressure. As European powers competed, France and Britain especially, Canada became a theater of imperial struggle. Forts rose along rivers. Alliances were forged and broken. And for Indigenous nations, these struggles were not distant politics. They were immediate disruptions. Rivalry between empires often meant pressure to choose sides, to supply, to fight to relocate. Even when treaties were signed, the landscape of power kept shifting. The land did not change, but the rules newcomers tried to enforce changed constantly. By the 1800s, Canada's historical development accelerated into infrastructure. The idea of binding such a vast region together required more than ships and trading posts. It required rail. The railway became one of the country's defining projects, a steel line across immense distance linking Atlantic to Pacific, pulling new towns into existence and allowing resources to move at industrial scale. The railway did not merely connect Canada, it redefined it. It enabled settlement extraction and control over territory that had previously been navigated through Indigenous systems of travel. But the price of that binding was heavy. Land was surveyed divided and claimed through legal frameworks that ignored older relationships to place. As agriculture expanded across the prairies, grasslands were transformed. Bison, once a living foundation for plains ecology and culture, were pushed toward collapse. New towns rose. Old routes were disrupted. The land became a grid, even in places where wind and water never moved in straight lines. Canada's national formation is often dated neatly. Confederation in 1867, the slow growth of provinces and territories. But the emotional reality of that history is less neat. For many Indigenous peoples, the same century that built railways and parliament also brought dispossession, broken promises, and a system designed to erase cultures. Residential schools became one of the darkest mechanisms of that project, a policy of forced assimilation that separated children from families' languages and traditions. The consequences did not end when the schools closed. They echo through generations, through communities, still rebuilding what was intentionally damaged. And yet Canada's story is not only a story of harm, it is also a story of survival and persistence. Indigenous governance and cultural resurgence continue today, often against enormous odds. Métis identity remains resilient. Inuit communities maintain deep relationships with land and sea, even as the Arctic transforms. Across the country, historical development keeps revealing a truth that the earliest explorers failed to understand. This land cannot be truly known without listening to the people who have lived in it for thousands of years. Today, Canada's economy still leans on resources, forestry, mining, energy, because the land holds them in abundance. But the country also carries a modern identity built on pluralism, multiple languages, migration, cities that feel global, and remote regions that still feel like edges of the inhabitable world. It is a place where skyscrapers and ice roads exist in the same nation, where rainforest and tundra both define what Canada means. So the historical arc tightens into the present. If the past was shaped by trade routes, rail lines, and borders drawn across enormous landscapes, what happens now when climate and fire begin to redraw the map again? And how does a country balance prosperity with the responsibility of protecting the systems that make life possible? In the modern imagination, Canada is often sold as a clean, quiet idea. Blue lakes, polite cities, endless pine. But the Canada of today is louder than the postcard. It is a country living through visible change, where seasons are shifting, where extremes are becoming less rare, and where the question of who gets to decide the future is no longer theoretical. One of the most dramatic signals is fire. Wildfire has always been part of many Canadian ecosystems, especially in the Boreal forest. Fire clears old growth, recycles nutrients, and can even trigger regeneration in certain species. In a natural cycle, it is destructive and necessary at the same time. But in recent years, the scale has started to feel different. Some fire seasons have grown longer, hotter, and more widespread, turning forests into fuel under heat and drought. Smoke can travel thousands of kilometers, dimming skies far from the flames, and turning daylight into something eerie. A sun that looks bruised, a city lit like late evening at noon. For the communities closest to the fire lines, the experience is not cinematic. It is evacuation, notices, anxious waiting, and the loss of homes, livelihoods, and familiar landscapes. It is also the quiet grief of watching a forest that held memories hunting grounds. Berry patches, trails change into blackened skeletons. And because Canada's vastness includes many remote regions, response is not always quick. Distance-limited roads and harsh conditions can make every emergency feel amplified. In the north, the transformation can be less dramatic but more unsettling thaw, where permafrost begins to soften the ground, loses its strength. Roads buckle, buildings shift, shorelines erode faster. In some places, what looked like stable land turns into a collapsing edge. For Arctic and subarctic communities, this is not only an environmental issue, it is infrastructure, housing, and safety. It is also culture. When ice forms later and breaks earlier, traditional travel routes become dangerous. Hunting becomes harder to predict. The calendar of the North, once anchored by reliable cold, starts to feel unstable. Meanwhile, along Canada's coasts, the relationship between tourism and conservation grows more complicated. Coastal towns can thrive on cruise ships and seasonal visitors, but those same visitors can strain local ecosystems and infrastructure. In mountain parks, the popularity of iconic locations brings traffic crowding and pressure on wildlife corridors. The modern Canadian landscape is still spectacular, but it is also heavily managed boardwalks to protect fragile ground, wildlife crossings to reduce collisions, regulations to reduce disturbance. In some places, the land has become famous, and fame, even for a landscape, can be a burden. This is where modern culture and modern conflict often meet, in the idea of use. Canada has long relied on extracting value from the land, timber, minerals, oil, gas, hydroelectric power. That extraction has built wealth, jobs, and cities. It has also left scars, disrupted habitats, pollution, and tension around what is lost in the process. The argument is not simply industry versus environment. It is often community versus community, present needs versus future costs, and local rights versus national economic agendas. And at the center of that debate, increasingly, is Indigenous sovereignty and voice. Across Canada, many Indigenous nations continue to assert land rights, protect sacred sites, and demand meaningful participation in decisions that affect their territories. This is not a symbolic issue, it is practical. In many cases, Indigenous knowledge offers a deeper understanding of local ecosystems, how fire behaves, how wildlife patterns shift, where water changes first. Indigenous-led conservation initiatives are growing. And so is the idea that protecting land is not only about preserving scenery, but about respecting relationships that existed long before modern borders. In the cities, Canada presents another face. Multicultural, fast-moving, and globally connected. Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver. These places feel like crossroads of the world, shaped by migration, food, language, music, and politics. But even in the urban centers, nature is never far away. Winter still arrives. Smoke still drifts in from distant fires. River levels still change. In Canada, the outdoors is not a weekend hobby. It is a presence that can interrupt daily life. Culture, too, holds contradictions. Canada celebrates wilderness, yet must reconcile with the ways settlement and development have altered that wilderness. It promotes itself as a place of openness, yet continues to work through the long shadows of colonial history. It relies on resource economies, yet faces the urgency of climate commitments. These are not simple problems, and Canada's modern identity is shaped by living inside those tensions rather than pretending they don't exist. And still, there are rituals of joy that feel distinctly Canadian winter festivals, where ice becomes art, summer nights stretched long enough to feel endless northern lights that turn the sky into moving paint, and the quiet pride of communities that endure harsh conditions without romanticizing them. There is also a growing cultural emphasis on sustainability, on learning to travel with lighter footprints to protect places before they become only memories, and to listen to voices that were ignored for too long. In the end, Canada's modern challenge is not merely to save nature. It is to decide what kind of relationship it wants with the land that defines it. A relationship based on extraction and control, or one based on reciprocity and restraint. Because in a country shaped by ice and distance, the consequences of choices may take years to appear, but when they do, they can be impossible to reverse. So as the camera pulls back past burning forests, thawing ground, crowded parks and cities that keep growing, the final question returns when the world's edge is no longer far away, when change is already here. What does it mean to protect a place this big? Canada is often introduced as a superlative second largest country, 3 oceans, endless forests, endless winter. But after following its ice-scarred bedrock, its living boreal heart, its ancient human routes, and its modern tensions, the superlatives start to feel like the least important part. Because Canada is not just big, Canada is still becoming. It is a land where the past is physically visible, in lakes left behind by glaciers and fjords, where the sea moved into valleys carved by ice, in rock older than most life on Earth. And it is a land where the present is equally visible smoke that crosses borders, coastlines, that erode faster than memory ground that softens where it used to hold firm. This is what makes the country feel like a threshold. 1 foot in deep time, 1 foot in the next decade. But the deepest story here is human. It is the knowledge that allowed people to live with winter not as an enemy, but as a teacher. It is the resilience of cultures that endured disruption and still carry languages, songs, and relationships with place. It is also the responsibility now placed on everyone who visits, settles, builds profits, or simply benefits from this land. To travel through Canada, whether in person or through a screen, is to be invited into a world that doesn't belong to spectators. These landscapes are not background, they are systems. They hold carbon-water migration roots and histories. They are still alive and they still remember. So the call to action is simple but not easy. Travel slower. Learn whose land you are standing on. Support Indigenous-led stewardship. Choose tourism and products that reduce harm. Listen to local science and to older knowledge that has survived where modern certainty has failed. And when you see a place that looks untouched, don't assume it will stay that way without effort. On a map, the world's edge is just a line. But in Canada, the edge is a living boundary between ice and wildfire and forest memory and future. And the question that lingers is the one every frontier eventually asks when the land is still changing beneath our feet. What will we choose to leave behind?